Welcome, everyone, to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. This week, I decided to do a somewhat lighter topic than some of the previous show reads. Once again, my guests are fanning out into later June or July. They will be here, but this is the time of year when a lot of people are finishing school and such, including my husband, but also some of my other guests, and they have other commitments, so we're just going to play it by ear on the interviews. And, I was thinking that rather than try another really serious topical read, I can do that in a week or two if, we still don't have a guest at that point. But I thought it would be kind of fun to look at, a frequently asked question from listeners and clients. I've been asking people to send stuff in, and I've gotten a few. And this first topic I'm going to chat about tonight is a question I get a lot. And I get it in one form or another, and it's a great way to do a show because I think this topic really needs to be talked about. And the question is basically, in a nutshell, what is a spell? And when I get this question, what is a spell, it's usually followed by, and will you cast one for me? Now, the thing is, at least 90% of the time, the person asking me this question really doesn't care that much about what a spell actually is. What they in fact really want is some way to force a targeted person, either someone they would like to be in a love relationship with, or more often someone who's talking about leaving that they've been in a relationship with and they want that person to stay. When I try to explain that I don't provide this service because it's an attempt to force another human being to do what they're not voluntarily doing. They've already said I'm leaving, or they have not shown any interest in this person. I'm usually met with floods of tears combined with sometimes some really tragic stories of partners leaving at the very worst times, which can be very troubling for me and the client. And I totally understand why the person wants a spell or they really want the person to come back. But it just points out even more clearly why I'm not going to do this, because, again, it's forcing someone to do something that they're not volunteering to do. One of the first clear rules of working with anything magical is you don't ever try to control the will of another adult human being without their personal consent or without a darn good reason. And trust me, there are very few reasons. Such reasons are extremely rare, and they're never without cost to the individual attempting the control. In general, it is almost always better to employ indirect forms of spiritual influence in a situation like that, such as prayer, or perhaps lighting a candle, which we'll talk about later, and wishing the person the best possible outcome, rather than trying to use magic to control them or to control that outcome. It just tends to not mesh really well if the person either isn't on board with you or perhaps doesn't know what's happening. And the other thing that I wanted to mention on this particular topic is that, like, one of my first magical groupings that I worked with other people, we were told that one of the reasons for this particular tenet or belief is that when you take responsibility for someone, when you try to force them to do something, that's what you're doing. You're becoming a parent to their child. So it's very, very rare that an adult is going to need this. Now, it's perfectly okay to do prayers or positive magic on behalf of your own children who you are in charge of when they are too young to have their own say in a matter, because provided it's positive. But for another adult, that's getting into some really dodgy territory, and that's really, in most cases, not a place you want to go. Now, this doesn't mean that spells or even other sorts of magic, provided you believe they exist, and if you don't, you may want to skip this show and wait. I'm going to have a really fascinating show on transhumanism hopefully coming up, and we're going to talk about science fiction and science of the future. But if you accept that magic exists, it's not that they have no place at all in our lives, or even that love spells are intrinsically wrong. It's just that there's a huge difference between a basic spirituality, or religion, if you prefer that word, if you like, and a magical spell and other similar types of practices. It isn't that the magical spell is wrong or never called for. It is that it's all too easy to abuse and bounce back. The impact can bounce back on the worker of the spell or the creator of the charm or the actor of the magic. And the more control over another is being attempted, in other words, the more you're trying to force the situation, the more likely it is to bounce back. So again, let's take a closer look at just what a spell is before we go any further. Now, simply put, a spell is a name for a magical action that attempts to influence or even change the outcome of something based on the actions taken by either the creator or the caster of the spell itself. Now, there's a lot of traditional ways to perform spells, from the very simple to the exasperatingly complex. They're related to something most people are familiar with. They're related to what we call prayer or divine intercession, but they're not exactly the same thing. I would call divine intercession when we talk to God, the goddess, the ancestors, or whomever we have a spiritual conversation with when we are talking to a being or beings outside of ourselves. And the most common form of prayer actually is a request for something. Now, there are entire books on theology about the nature of this sort of prayer request, and even if it's a good idea for people to do them at all. But as it is, I'm pretty sure that since the Stone Age, the otherworld beings who get prayers addressed to them have heard a lot more requests than they have experienced people practicing, say, various forms of spiritual meditation in a search for the divine and to listen and to get guidance or answers. Which is not to say that these are not worthy goals, to listen and to receive information from the divine. It's just that it takes a degree of spiritual maturity that a lot of human beings either haven't reached yet or simply only dimly understand that it even exists. We may get little glimpses of this in our mortal lives, but for the most part, prayer that most people have is more usually requesting things. But pretty much asking a divine being, God, goddess, divine ancestor, etc., to do something or make something happen or otherwise change things, that's a prayer because you're asking. Now, it may look like a spell, and in some religious traditions, it may even be chanted or otherwise spoken in a similar way to a spell. Some traditions have ways that you say things like a rosary, and it's said that way every time, but it does not make it a spell. It's not even uncommon to have prayers as part of an active spell, but effectively it's not the same thing as the actual spell. You're including the prayer usually as a form of request for intercession or for protection, often both. Now, why do I say this? I say this because one is religion, and generally it has a spiritual safety net of at least appearing to ask for something. Now, small children and adults, especially under stress, may take this to the very limits and ask such things as, God, please give me a puppy. I'll be good, and I promise I won't make mommy feed it. Or, Goddess, just let me win the lottery, and I'll pay all of my bills. Usually followed by, or, just let me win this racehorse. Those are great examples of the sort of prayers I suspect the spiritual realms get a bit of a smile out of, especially when they come from little kids. And are probably a bit tired of hearing from adults who ought to know better than to put their race money, their rent money on the races. But they're still more or less requests of a sort. In a lot of cases, they're not requests that are likely to be granted, or if they are, they may not be in the same form or fashion as the person putting the prayer forward is hoping for, but they still have the protection of a request that can be gently but firmly denied. When I was a little girl, I remember a pastor in my mother's church preaching an entire sermon on the topic, When God Says No. I was really too little to understand most of it, but the point did get across to me that you don't have to view the divine as an old man on the throne to get the general idea that human beings are free to ask for divine help for something or make a request, but sometimes the answer to the question may be in the negative. It's not always yes. Prayer is, in theory at least, a conversation of a sort, even if most of the time human beings don't tend to wait around for the answer, unless they're like forced to by circumstance, or just are amazingly spiritually mature. A spell, on the other hand, is a direct action. It attempts to force and control the outcome by using various means of magical influence to accomplish it. So you see the difference? In prayer, you're asking and making a request from something beyond yourself. With a spell, you're trying to force something to happen or for an event to occur by something you yourself are putting into motion. Now, that said, this does not always mean a spell is a bad idea or even inappropriate. There are plenty of times when a person may request a spell to be cast in order to help them accomplish something or to try to make something happen. Anyone, a professional or not, should always be careful when providing or performing spells, because even though a lot of spells have a prayer as a component, you're still taking a step away from the basic protections built into prayer and are moving more towards the consequences of taking the influencing of the universe into your own or perhaps another's hands if you're doing it on behalf of someone else, in which case you're both in for it if anything goes wrong. But on the other hand, done correctly, you may both benefit in some way should things be done properly. This is why love spells, especially those trying to force a person to engage with someone against their will, can be very dangerous. They may even sort of work for a time in the sense that there's a temporary result that appears to create the desired situation. But even when this happens, there's almost always going to be a backlash somewhere along the way. If the person who's being charmed, essentially, in quotes, they're charmed, I throw a spell on you, didn't really want the outcome in the first place. Now, sometimes, it all goes okay because really the person kind of wanted it to happen anyhow. And so you're not really going against kind of the flow of the universe, which I'll talk about further down. But if it is not what the person really wanted, then the consequences may not show up immediately. But in my experience, they pretty much always do happen. And magic, unlike prayer, has a big difference. And that is, magic does not take good intentions into account when forming a reaction. How many people today, starting with my father's generation in the 1930s, have seen the movie Fantasia, with Mickey Mouse as the sorcerer's apprentice? This fairy tale of the young apprentice wizard who decides it will be easier to copy one of his master's spells and make the mop the floor rather than just do the labor himself is one of the best examples I can think of for this particular magical problem. It doesn't matter that the young man, his intention, he only wanted the floor mopped by one mop and then quietly for the mop to go back to being in the corner. His inexperience in both casting spells and what we could call focused intention, plus his inability to know how to create magical safeguards and, keep him safe, creates a situation where the mop is simply going to keep splitting into dozens, hundreds, ultimately thousands of mops, probably destroying everything, including Mickey himself, if the master has not returned in time to put the counter spell on and put things to right. Now, obviously, this is a Disney movie based on an old legend, and in real life, well, most spells don't result in quite that much of an obvious physical disaster as the Night of 1,000 Mops. But in the spiritual realm, and often bleeding into the physical one, inexperienced or blind spellcasting can have some really dangerous and nasty side effects. A person may very well think they're casting a spell for one thing, most commonly for love or money. Those are the two most popular requests I get. Traditionally, they were probably healing, but these days, it's love and money are popular. But because they really have no idea what they're sending out there, they may get a totally different reaction than what they're looking for. Examples I have personally seen or heard about, and also exist in cautionary tales and legends, Or, for example, having some other person than the intended target fall in love with the person that's casting the spell or having the spell cast for them. Now, we see this in traditional legends like Tristan and Isolde. You see it in Rheingold. You see it in a number of Celtic and Nordic folklore, and probably if I looked other places as well. The person that you want to fall in love with you is not the one who actually does. The spell somehow misfires, and you get love, but not what you wanted. The health of either the spellcaster or the person being charmed or bespelled can be affected in a negative way. Sometimes both occur, and I've seen that happen where you're trying to make somebody love you and instead they get sick or you get sick. Or, the person decides to get back into the relationship, all right, but it all goes horribly wrong after that and it all ends in tears. Because really, the flow of things was that the couple should part no matter how painful it was. And by forcing the other person back, you've created a very negative situation. And those are not the only potentially bad outcomes of low spells, but they're certainly among the three most common that I've seen. You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages.
Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melody, just go to my website, melodypsychicreadings.com. That's Melody with an I, psychicreadings.com, for information, or email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today?
We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future. So am I saying that spells are always a bad idea and that we should never ever do them? Well, no, not at all. I'm just suggesting that the average person, especially someone in the midst of a traumatic situation like unrequited love, or even worse, the collapse of an existing relationship or marriage, is usually not in the best position to be trying to use active magic to force an outcome of the situation. Even more so if, like most people, they have no training in how to do it and when it may be a good idea. When it is a good idea. Sadly, even though I caution people when they call or write me for spells, I know in my heart they're probably just going to keep looking for someone who will give them something. Often for a rather large outlay of cash. There's always people willing to take your money. And if it was only wasted money, it wouldn't concern me so much. But it's because I know that it can often make things worse that I tell them if they simply must go through with this, they need to find a trained professional who will listen to their situation and provide a service for a reasonable fee if they think it will help. Thankfully, I do know a few honest people who will do this sort of work, but even they will often say, and this is why I will recommend them, they'll say to a client, I'm sorry, I really can't help you either. I'm not going to do this because, most of what I would think of as like white magical warders or white witches totally understand the problem I'm talking about with trying to force a person's own desires onto another human being without their consent. And they're just not going to expose either themselves or their clients to this sort of thing. In a pinch, I'll tell people about the candle trick, or the candle prayer, really. It's not really a trick, it's more like a prayer, but it'll feel like a spell. And that's where you take a colorful candle, and there's a lot of books and pamphlets on candle magic, but really basic. What if it means something to you, like red for love, green for money, and sometimes green for healing or blue for healing, are really, really good, just sort of basics. But, you can go and research the net if you want more colors. But basically, if you light a colored candle and you make a request while doing so, This once again puts it pretty much back into the realm of prayer. You're slightly moving into magic because you're lighting the candle and kind of intensifying it, but it's probably one of the safer forms of magic that anyone can perform. And if you walk into most like Anglican or Catholic churches, you'll see people doing this sort of prayer with a candle all the time. And that, I think, is actually, it's very difficult to get yourself into trouble with that because, again, it's kind of a combination. But having warned my listeners about casting spells, what are some situations where they may be appropriate? I mean, after all, I've gone on the negative so much, but what's positive? Okay, the real kicker here is the idea of mutual or personal consent. It may be slightly dangerous to say cast a personal spell to make yourself some more money if you don't know what you're doing, but provided you're not physically trying to take money from someone else who doesn't wish to provide it. I mean, you're not trying to force Aunt Mabel to put you in her will, and when she hates you, that would be very dangerous, particularly if you don't know what you're doing. But, as long as you're just generically saying, I'd like to get a raise, or I'd like to get some more money, your only potential target is you, and that's your decision. So, you're not involving anybody else. It's perfectly okay. Especially if you do some research or have somebody that knows what they're doing help you with it. Mutual consent can also take place in the love realm and with relationships. The same spell that might be a spiritual ticking time bomb ready to blow up if you were trying to force a partner back into a relationship that they wanted to end could become a wonderful and delightful push towards mutual understanding and benefit if both partners in the relationship are, say, trying for a reconciliation and want to get back together. And I have dealt with situations like that where, simple prayer might be a bit safer, but a love charm designed to work positive magic on two people who are having a bit of a rocky patch, but ultimately want to try to work it out, it could be, very magical in helping the universe flow in the way, especially when there's a human will trying to sort it out in that direction anyway. And especially if it's combined with a prayer for the right outcome, so that, say, maybe it's just better if these two people do part eventually. It happens in a much less explosive and much more loving way than it would had they not thrown the spell in the first place. In other words, we're not trying to force things, but we're trying to assist them. Another great example is a spell, or really it's more like a charm, and I'll get into the difference between charms and spells in a moment. My husband was asked to provide a married woman friend of ours. She very much wanted a child, and so did her partner, and she asked my husband for a love charm, a pregnancy charm, or a pregnancy spell. Now, my husband's a highly trained magician, and he made a charm he hoped would be effective, and told the young woman what to do with it and where to place it in their home. And they know, for reasons I won't go into that are personal, she got pregnant that evening, and the baby's great. So that's a true story, and everyone was delighted. But of course, being a highly trained magical worker, my husband also knows how to put in the safeguards so you don't force the issue. If it isn't a good time, if the child won't be healthy, if there are problems, if any number of things happen, the charm could be essentially delayed or even deactivated if that is the best possible course. That is the big issue with inexperienced spellcasting. Not knowing how to make the brooms stop multiplying. Not knowing how to create those magical backups that help shield everyone from the unintended consequences of our good intentions. Again, remember, prayer, or religion if you like, the divine other world, usually takes your real intentions and often your own personal good into account when you ask for the puppy or whatever it is that you're praying on. Magic on its own has no such safeguards. It's only bound by the degree of talent and force behind a spell or charm, although it may be affected by other things such as the energies of the day, like we read in the cards. Some days may be, or astrologically may be more auspicious for a particular type of working to occur. Or say if you're trying to influence someone even positively, their personal shields may just sort of bounce it off if they have strong personal psychic shields. And a sufficiently magically shielded person may have such a charm, just bounce off them, but then it goes back to the original caster. And some traditions, some magical traditions, believe it may even come back 3 or as much as 7 times. Now, this idea of what's sometimes called the threefold law or the sevenfold law is a primary tenet or belief in many magical traditions. Even if it doesn't simply bounce back to you, again, in religion, your intent, it matters a lot here. In actual magic, well, maybe the intent matters not so much. It's going to do what it's going to do. Other areas where actual spells can be very positive, done properly, and are seldom harmful, can be combined with prayer to improve a situation, is in the area of healing. Healing charms and spells are probably even older than love spells, though it's probably running a close race there in human history. And the majority I've seen worldwide seem to include some sort of prayer as part of their magical working. It's as if people working in healing, even back when there wasn't a whole lot you could do except do a magical working and hope for the best, people understood that a certain amount of the art of medicine was not in the hands of the physician or the healer, but it was in the hands of the divine. So, even if you're doing it by magic rather than a scalpel, or you're using magic to aid the scalpel, there's still that third element of something beyond that actually helps accomplish the healing. But again, consent is very important. You don't want to go casting healing spells for someone who would find it personally abhorrent or went against their personal religious faith. In those cases, simple prayer again, perhaps with lighting the green or the purple candle, is enough. Purple, blue, green are the 3 most common. That asking for either healing or the best ultimate outcome is the way to go. I mean, there's different kinds of healing, and this is again where it gets very dicey. We don't always know the best outcome. We have to trust that something higher than ourselves hopefully does. But when there is mutual consent, there's no problem at all in having a trained practitioner provide a healing charm, spell, or ritual. And of course, as I said earlier, a parent could do this on behalf of a sick child. It's really only with adults that the mutual consent thing becomes extremely important. Of course, it's certainly magically okay to ask for healing for yourself, but again, unless you're already magically trained, and in this case, even sometimes if you are, it's probably better to have someone else who is trained to create and perform the charm, spell, or with healing, perhaps ritual on your behalf. Some of the best healing spells of this sort require a sick person to play a small role anyway, such as chanting a certain bit or praying or doing something, and that makes them a part of the process. It's just that when you're ill, it's probably not the best time to be trying to move magic around. This subject is far too vast to get into detail here, but again, with healing, you really want to leave the door open for that best possible outcome, which isn't always what we think it is. And it's the same thing when you're dealing with like spells for childbearing or pregnancy, that you want a good outcome and hope for the best, basically. Don't make demands on things, because if you demand things too specifically, you may not like the results. And like I said, with magic, you don't have that protection of the intention. So what is a charm and what is a spell exactly? I've been using both these terms. What do I mean? Well, the difference is a charm is basically a physical object or creation that has a magical power sort of infused into it. It could be just about anything, and traditionally it's often hidden in plain sight. It can be a wall decoration. Some of the beautiful paintings in the German and the Pennsylvania Deutsch traditions are, what they call the hex signs. Well, those are sort of little charms for protection, and they're very pretty, and they just sort of hang on the wall, or they decorate an object. That's very common. It could be a piece of jewelry. This is the magic rings all come from that, or the magic necklace. Well, this is an item that you have charged magically to do something. It could be it's like a small article of clothing, like a handkerchief, or a tiny token that can be secretly worn or put away. I think the most modern version of this would be your lucky rabbit's foot. That's kind of a holdover from the time when almost everybody carried a little charm or something worn for protection, healing, luck, or other small magic. Now, they might not have considered it to be magic. They might have had like a rosary or something, but basically when you're using it in that context, it's kind of becoming a bit of a charm. It's that gray area again between magic and religion, but it's basically an object that has been spelled, essentially. Now, a dream catcher would be another great example of something that operates like a charm, even if that's not necessarily its official designation. Because, you put it above your bed, it's supposed to catch your dreams, and in that way it's sort of been magicked or charmed to activate or to do something. It's supposed to help you catch your dreams. A spell, on the other hand, is the actual act of performing the magic. Sometimes it's to activate a charm, or simply to put the desired magical event into motion. Spells usually involve certain types of words, and are either declared or sung, chanted, although sometimes they can be written on a piece of paper, and they might be basically activated by another sort of action, like throwing them into the water, or burning them in a fireplace or a candle. Usually, when you purchase a spell off someone, you are in fact buying a charm or a charmed object that they have magicked for you on your behalf, or at least they supposedly have. If they include instructions for chanting, or otherwise saying something as you hold the charm, then you're being included in this casting of the spell itself. You're not doing the whole thing necessarily, but you're activating it when you do this. Be very sure that you trust the person who is doing this for you, and be very wary of just buying something like, called True Love or Money Spell off the internet for all the reasons I've been talking about up to this point. Yes, it's perfectly okay to ask for love in general. If you've reached a point in your life where you no longer wish to be single, for example, casting a simple and very general love spell with a get-out clause of, if it's the right time, I would like to meet the right person for me, because say I'd like to get married, or I'd like to get married and have a family, words to that effect of what you're looking for. As long as you leave the potential for a no answer and aren't forcing anyone in particular to love you, that's perfectly fine. Now, being human beings, we can't escape the fact that what we're doing is an image of Johnny will come into our brain. But we're still not we're not casting the spell for Johnny specifically. We just think he might make a cool partner. Again, it's that difference. If that was the sort of love spell clients were usually asking for, I wouldn't have any problem providing it, or showing them simple ways, like the red candle exercise, plus a bit to do it for themselves. I mean, a great example of one way you can do this fairly safely, one lady I know who also does medieval stuff, was at a point in her life where she wanted a partner. And being very much into Viking things, she created an image that she sewed as part of this sort of spell to the universe of Odin's eight-legged horse Sleipnir. It was kind of a focused charm, and she concentrated on while she was sewing. Now, doing things like sewing or creating are great ways to do sort of safer magic. I do this a lot. I knit for babies, and I'll knit for the specific baby while it's still in the womb, and I'll think wonderful thoughts for that baby. And I'm not trying to control that baby. I just want it to be protected and loved and healthy, and each stitch that goes into that garment is kind of part of the spell. And there's a lot of traditional love magic that's actually like that, where the woman makes a shirt or something for the man that she wishes to, or at least, for a potential husband, or possibly the one she wants to marry. Well, in this case, she did it right. She didn't have a particular person in mind, but she sort of stitched this sort of banner. Well, she thought about a life partner, the type of things she enjoyed doing, and hoped she would enjoy with this person. And very soon after she finished it, she met her future husband, who also does a lot of Viking reenactment stuff. And the design on his shield was almost the same one as she had sewn. And she just knew he was the right person. And it wasn't identical, but it was very close. And, they've been married over a decade now, have a couple of kids. It worked really, really well. So that's the kind of positive, intentional magic you can use that, again, you don't have to have a lot of training for. So it isn't that spells or charms are wrong in and of themselves, as I said before. It's just a problem when they're used to try to force someone, or even a group of people, trying to force a bunch of people to serve the will of someone else. And you see this a lot in even it's fantasy and science fiction, where the evil person, what makes them evil is they're trying to force everyone into the empire, or they're trying to force everyone to be their slave, or whatever it is, as opposed to letting people live their own lives. Especially when people would not consent to whatever it is without the magical coercion. Spells and charms are also more personally dangerous than simple prayer, because a person using magic does not have the same protections regarding good intentions as a spiritual petition to the divine is likely to get. It is never a good idea to try a charm or spell that you simply read in a book without training or preparing how to use this. I cannot emphasize this too much. Please do not go either on the internet. These days, old days you had to go in the library and all the books would be, half of them would be gone because people would steal them. But now you can just go on the internet, you just don't, and look up love spell. Just don't. You want to go to a trusted professional and get references first. Get references for these people. Any good practitioner will be fine with this, will happily probably even provide you with references. At least check out their website and then see what other people have to say about them. For example, in Ireland, we have there's a forum where people can go and report on what they think of how different people are, and it can be quite enlightening. Now, no one's going to like everybody all the time, and there's always going to be the potential for somebody just not hitting it off, but you get a pretty good idea on whether this person seems to be at least legitimate or not just by getting references. And specifically, run away. You cannot run away fast enough from anyone demanding huge sums of money, and it promises you definite results. The best spells and charms normally only provide an influence. Just a bit of extra energy that can nudge things in one direction or the other. Some practitioners and some spells may be more powerful than others, but no one, I repeat that, no one can promise you a certain outcome at all the time. And anyone who claims to do this, especially if they're requesting large amounts of money, is most likely either potentially deluded or an actual fraud. And in either case, you don't want to mess with them. If you're in a pinch, I really feel a need to do something a bit more than just direct prayers, but don't have access to any professional help, a relatively safe alternative, again, is to light that candle with what's called an intention, or essentially saying a prayer or an affirmation as you do so. Imagine sending out your request for love, or for healing, or perhaps the rent money as you do so, but frame it as a request and not a demand. You can do similar things by lighting a fire in the fireplace, watching the sun sprinkle and sparkle through your fingers as you sit by a pool of water, other things that provide a sort of physical echo for you to concentrate your focus on, but essentially it's still all part of the spiritual request. It's not the candle that makes it magical, it's that intent again. In my experience, the best magic is that which flows along with the intentions of the universe, rather than trying to dam it and stop the flow. There are exceptions to this basic idea, but that really is for a more advanced magical discussion that we're having right now for this show. For simple magic, you want it to try to flow. And what I mean by that is often when I read for clients, I do what I call the 2 outcome reading, where they have 2 possible choices. This works really well, if it's should I take this job or that job? And I will read for both without knowing which is which. The person knows which one I'm reading, but I don't know until it's over. It is often really obvious, though, almost from the first card, that one choice is what I call being in the flow of things, and the other simply is not. It feels difficult. It isn't that the second choice is necessarily bad. It just means that it's sort of bucking the tide of the way things are going, and it's just going to be a harder path. A magical spell or charm is likely to be of more effect when cast in the direction of that flow rather than trying to buck against it, for pretty much the same reasons. That doesn't mean there's never a reason to try to do that, but in general they just work better if they're not going that way. Well, I think it sums up pretty much charms and spells. And I know this show's a bit shorter than usual, but since I'm having minor surgery next week and I've got a bunch of things happening, I didn't want to miss another week like I did last week. So I thought that this would be an interesting topic. And if you have any questions about this or other topics, or if you'd like a Veldoffer who will be not exactly off for the summer, but will be home studying, and hopefully we could do more shows, if you want to just write me at Melodi Reader, that's Melody with an I, at gmail.com, and I'll show him his questions and I'll look at some of yours. And the same thing is true also for topics of interest that you might like me to do more serious readings on. Like I said, this show was kind of just a stand back from all the really heavy stuff, because quite frankly, if we only concentrate on the really serious and the kind of dire doom, you get out of balance. And we'll talk about that on another show, but another really important aspect of magic is balance and keeping things balanced, which is, what we try to do with the cards, what we try to do with energy, what we try to do with all the things in our life. But I think for tonight, that's about it. And I'd like to thank my listeners for joining me here at Cat's Eye in the Future. And I'll see you again next time. You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.